Well, Director, Your Excellency, Ambassador O'Malley, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, really is an honour to be here this evening, and I very much appreciate being invited to deliver the 15th John Hume Lecture. Before I go on to what I wanted to say myself, I think I should respond in a small measure to what Ambassador O'Malley said. It is very useful, I think, to hear an outside perspective on ourselves and to remember the qualities that will drive us forward, and sometimes to put aside some of our own faults, which are quite often to concern ourselves with retribution and blame rather than trying to work out how we make things better in the future. And a lot of our political endeavours, I think, recently, and I think the banking inquiry is a good thing, by the way. I'm not saying anything negative about it, but I think that the amount of political effort that goes into enterprises like that is in remarkable contrast to the amount of political effort that is put into considering the points that Ambassador O'Malley has raised for us. And I would say this too, that to our media, you can extract apologies, and you can point the finger of blame, and you can get people to wear sackcloth and ashes, but in essence, it's the same issue in many respects as we encounter in respect of our bankruptcy law. The real question is, what do we do next? And how do we learn from our experience, rather than who can we blame and who can we point the finger at and who can we criticise. As I said, it's truly an honour that I didn't expect, and an occasion of real gratitude on my part, to have been asked to deliver this lecture in honour of John Hume, who was and is a great Irishman, a true statesman, and above all, a towering constitutionalist. John Hume has been both visionary and realist in equal measure and in great abundance. And ultimately, those twin attributes of vision and realism impelled him to make a personal sacrifice which few would be willing to make, and many, including myself, believe he should never have been asked to make, not merely to put the interest of his country on the one hand before his own personal and party interest, but to save the interests of his country at great cost to his own personal and party interest. And if you go to St Paul's Cathedral in London, you'll see the monument there to Christopher Wren, the man who designed St Paul's Cathedral. And what's written there in Latin, and this is from Michael Gallagher, is Si monumentum requiris circumspice, which means if you're looking for a monument, look all around you. And if you would search for John Hume's monument, I think we as Irish people just have to look around us at this transformed island. We now have on this island the end of communal violence within our grasp. We now have the building blocks of reconciliation at our feet. Whatever the difficulties, imperfections and setbacks that we have encountered, we have begun to act at last on John Hume's greatest belief, namely that we in Ireland have more in common than divides us. I've spoken here on previous occasions about what I call the great Republican vocation, the challenge of our tricolour flag, the call that beckons every Irish woman and Irish man the task of reconciling orange and green. And it is the great uncompleted task on this island. But in identifying, defining and articulating that task of reconciliation, and literally giving everything to its accomplishment, John Hume, perhaps in unusual terms, can be described not just as a great Irishman, statesman and constitutionalist, but as a true Republican. Now, permit me, therefore, in this lecture to draw on two of those attributes which we most admire: Hume's constitutionalism, his vision, and above all, his realism. And with John Hume's realism especially in mind, let me deal with a very real issue, which literally demands the immediate attention of the Irish people and their elected leaders. And that's the dysfunction that has characterised, impaired and crippled our democratic representative institutions. We know for a certainty that we're facing a general election to take place before the next MacGill summer school in Glenties next year. The only thing that's uncertain about it is its exact timing. But I want to put before you this evening a few very plain, simple, practical home truths and a few simple, practical steps to address the issues about which I wish to speak. And if Yogi Berra didn't say it, my message is, it ain't rocket surgery. If some of these issues of institutional dysfunction are not addressed in the next 6 months, before the election is held, they will not be addressed at all. It'll be too late if we postpone action until after the forthcoming election. The cynical, dysfunctional, partisan politics that we've come to disdain will continue unabated unless we act now. There will be no new politics. If the next Dáil starts out on its new term on the basis of its existing standing orders, which it's set fair to do because nobody's suggesting changing them, there will be no change in its culture or its effectiveness. So I really want to say this is a case of now or never. Now, it's become almost universally accepted that the Irish political system suffers gravely from a culture and an ingrained practice which allows the government, the executive, to completely dominate and subjugate our Parliament. Equally, there's a consensus that someone, somewhere, sometime should do something to redress the imbalance between the executive and our Parliament and to restore the standing of Parliament and parliamentarians in our democracy. But what is to be done? Crucially, I think we believe we need very badly to have the executive, the government, and all its agencies to become really and substantially answerable to the Dáil and to its committees. And we need parliamentarians in both houses of the Oireachtas who see themselves as something more than pawns manipulated by the government of the day. We need ministers who will face real searching parliamentary scrutiny by bipartisan committees. We don't need to postpone every sensitive issue to a judicially managed commission of inquiry. Tinkering around with populist gimmicks such as reducing the number of TDs or reducing their pay not merely achieves nothing, it's utterly counterproductive to the achievement of parliamentary accountability. We need real reform now. Now, the first reform I wanted to put before you is this: the position of Ceann Comhairle. Ceann Comhairle is the Speaker of Dáil Éireann, which the Constitution describes as a House of Representatives, is a constitutional office of vital importance. And I think that that position should not be left to be dealt with in the aftermath of an election on the same basis as it has been treated up to now. Under the standing orders of Dáil Éireann, the very first item after the next election will be the selection of Ceann Comhairle. And if those standing orders aren't changed, the Ceann Comhairle will be elected on the same basis, inevitably, as his predecessors have been. And that is that it will be done on the say-so of the incoming government and on the basis of a whipped party vote. Now, I think that that office cannot continue to be a consolation prize for a disappointed would-be minister. It cannot remain in the gift of the incoming government to be bartered away as one of the spoils of electoral victory between those who share ministerial power. You get the Attorney Generalship, we'll give you the Ceann Comhairle-ship. Dáil Éireann needs an elected Speaker who is in reality, and is seen by the people to be, wholly and unambiguously mandated and empowered to act as the proactive champion of each and every Dáil deputy in vindicating their twin constitutional functions, which are firstly to hold the executive power to account and secondly to legislate. And therefore the next Ceann Comhairle I propose tonight must be chosen in a process that unambiguously guarantees that whoever is appointed will be seen as and will be the embodiment and public face of the protection of members' individual and collective rights. And if that's not part of the new politics, you can forget the new politics. Now, how can this be done? The first requirement is that standing orders of Dáil Éireann be amended now, because if they're not amended before the election takes place, the process will be done in the manner that it's been done before. To provide that any candidate for appointment as Ceann Comhairle must in future go through a two-stage process. The first is that they must be initially proposed for nomination by any 8 TDs on a cross-party basis. That is, that they have to be proposed and seconded, as is normal, by 2 TDs, and have the written assent of 6 other TDs, 4 of who aren't in the same party or group as the proposer and seconder. And the second, and this is what happens in Westminster, by the way, both stages happen in Westminster at the moment, being nominated for appointment on foot of a free and secret ballot by a single transferable vote of all the incoming members of the next Dáil. So the idea that the speakership of our Parliament is a consolation prize or in the gift of the government would be swept away. Only a person who had cross-party support could be a candidate, and the person who was selected would be selected by a free and secret ballot of all the members of Dáil Éireann. And the same applies to the last Ceann Comhairle. The second requirement I suggest to you, and this also requires a simple amendment of the standing orders of the Dáil, is that the Ceann Comhairle makes a new and different declaration of office from the one that's currently provided, which just asks him to be impartial, committing him or her to securing the real and effective accountability of the executive power, government and agencies to Dáil Éireann, as is required by Article 28(4) of the Constitution. It should be part of the very first thing he does to make a declaration before his colleagues in Parliament that he takes his job seriously in demanding that the executive be accountable to the members of Dáil Éireann. And the next Ceann Comhairle should also, I think, have explicit power under these amended standing orders to protect Dáil Éireann from excessive use of the guillotine and to ensure that there's adequate debate except in wholly exceptional emergency circumstances. And it should be up to him to decide whether a guillotine is justifiable, not to the people who benefit from the guillotine and who benefit from suppressing debate. The next Ceann Comhairle should also have, I think, an overriding discretion to ensure that individual deputies with a demonstrated desire to make specific points in debate are not unfairly excluded from doing so by group or party arrangements of speaking times in debates. What do I mean by that? I mean that at the moment, the whips of the parties decide to allocate the speaking times. They decide who speaks and in what order, and it doesn't matter. You can be there all day listening to the debate, and you have no chance of getting in. In the United Kingdom Parliament, that's not the case. I'll tell you an amusing story. There was a Conservative MP who went up to the Speaker, I think it was Bernard Weatherill, on one occasion. He said, "I've spent the whole afternoon trying to catch your eye, and I'm really disappointed that you didn't call me, because I put a lot of effort and had something very worthwhile to say." And the Speaker leaned down from his chair and said, "You're very unlucky on 2 accounts. One, that you didn't catch my eye, and secondly, that this occurred on the only occasion that you've ever had anything useful to say." But it is the case that incident only goes to show that it is the case that in the United Kingdom, the chair is given the right to say, that man or that woman has been here for the whole afternoon, and he or she, I know, has something to say, and I'm not going to just simply go through a list of people supplied from an office somewhere else. And in order to foster genuine debate in the Dáil rather than a succession of prearranged speeches to an empty chamber, the chair should also be empowered to give preference to TDs who have attended the debate and have participated by their presence. And I think that if these steps were taken, just these steps alone, and they're simple ones, as I say, they're not rocket surgery, these steps were taken, the chair in Dáil Éireann would be someone who, from now on, was regarded differently and would the occupant of a constitutional office, which is, in terms of the paper of the Constitution, a very important one. He's the person who's, for instance, on the Presidential Commission. He's on the Council of State. He's supposed to ensure that the Dáil functions properly. He's guaranteed re-election in return for assuming the job. And what I'm saying here is that these steps alone could produce a very, very different atmosphere in Dáil Éireann if, when the Taoiseach stands up and does or does not answer a question, that the person who's in the chair is not there by the grace and favour of the Taoiseach and doesn't owe their position to a piece of political patronage, but is there because a cross-party process led to their nomination and the members of Dáil Éireann, in a secret ballot, elected them to hold that position. So, warming to that theme, could I suggest to you that a similar cross-party nomination process for this would be quite apposite for the selection of chair and vice-chairman of committees, and that can be done, again, very simply by amending standing orders of the Dáil. Why is it that the government hands out the chairmanships of committees to TDs? And worse still, why should it be that those people who do get those offices can be removed by the fiat of the government whip, just like that, for being insubordinate, being inconvenient, being whatever, saying the wrong thing or voting the wrong way? So I think that it should be the case that if you are an officer of a committee, you can only be removed from that office for stated reasons, for stated misbehaviour, effectively, and that you stay there for the full duration of the Dáil. And I think that we need committees which will in future hold ministers to continual and effective scrutiny, and which are elected and composed in a manner which encourages bipartisanship and solidarity among their members. I can tell you one thing. When I was a minister, I relied on the fact that I had a majority in every committee, and I knew that in the end of the day, although they might ask some hard questions, they were never going to report against me, because that was the way the system worked. And that's wrong. I believe that the standing and independence and effectiveness of all TDs who are not ministers can be greatly enhanced by giving them the unambiguous right to carry out their constitutional roles in a manner which takes them out of the dark shadow of executive patronage and excessive control of the party whip, and places them unambiguously in the political sunlight as champions of the principle of holding the executive accountable. Likewise, I believe that independent TDs, and there are probably going to be a good number of them elected, would be fairly protected and their standing enhanced if standing orders were amended in this way. Why should none of them chair or participate in committees except as a matter of grace and favour during the pleasure of the government, which in theory is supposed to be accountable to those committees? Now, are these proposals practicable? And the answer is yes. Firstly, none of these proposals would cost a single cent. None of the proposals requires any bill to change the law or any amendment to our constitution. All these changes simply require that there are a set of amendments to the standing orders of the Dáil which can be adopted at any time by a vote of the present Dáil. If there really is a will for these reforms among TDs and parties, the drafting could be started this month and could be ready for implementation in October so that it will apply to the next Dáil, well in advance of the forthcoming election. I'm not aware that any party has opposed these changes. The government was supposed to be considering the system of electing a Ceann Comhairle at a meeting they held 2 years ago. But I have to say to you, I suspect that the reason that they held their hand and left it as it is that they were hoping that the present incumbent would step down and they'd be able to shift in somebody in a dodgy constituency and collect the benefit of a free pass into the next Dáil for that person. On the contrary, a number of these proposals have received expressions of support in principle from a wide variety of elected politicians and parties, and from commentators. Micheál Martin suggested on the occasion of the election of the last Ceann Comhairle, I think 2 of the newer parties have endorsed the idea. And above all, the famous Constitutional Convention, all of whose proposals with the exception of the reduction in voting age, were studiously ignored. It pointed to this as a reform which was necessary. And perhaps they could be given at least the grudging respect of implementing something which doesn't require us to go to the process of referendum. And as I say, that proposal of cross-party election and cross-party nomination applies in Westminster. Why is it that we can't have it here? And these proposals aren't some form of populist gimmickry. Unlike previous so-called reform proposals, these proposals have the undeniable potential to transform the culture and the effectiveness of Dáil Éireann. And being practical, we're not going to change the manner of election of our TDs. There isn't going to be a referendum in the foreseeable future to get rid of multi-seat PR, because the present people are suited by that. And we're not going to have any law, a constitutional change to reduce the number of TDs. It's at the minimum, and the TDs who are there at the moment don't propose to bring it down any further. But these steps, if they were taken, could create an entirely different climate for our Parliament to work in the future. Now, I pose the question, are these proposals naive? And I'm speaking here not from self-interest, but from the perspective and with the varied experiences of a former opposition TD who served 2 terms, a former Attorney General, a former Minister and a former Taoiseach. When I wasn't an office holder, I believe the culture and procedures of Dáil Éireann prevented me and my colleagues in opposition from holding the executive to adequate account. And when I was an office holder, the same culture and procedures prevented me and my colleagues in government from being held to adequate account by Dáil Éireann. And I think that in both scenarios, the result was seriously wrong and damaging, and that while some politicians may cynically calculate that they will over time play in both directions on what is a very unlevel playing field, and somehow that some of them may hope to win more than they lose, the real fact is that the only people who lose constantly from the lack of executive accountability to Dáil Éireann are the people of Ireland, who lose in every way from the fact that those who administer our affairs are in general terms non-accountable to an extraordinary extent. Now, another question that arises, would Ireland be more difficult to govern under these changed conditions? And my answer to that question is very simply this: Ireland would be more difficult to govern badly if these changes were made. What is a really effective government to fear from the Ceann Comhairle having a role in relation to the use of the guillotine? I'm not saying it should be an absolute role, but it should be one which makes it difficult to use on occasion. And if you go back to the beginning of the lifetime of this government, in all good faith they promised that they would use it extremely sparingly and only in the rarest of circumstances. And of course that turned out to be a promise they couldn't keep, because in the present culture they have used it regularly, every week, and they've used it on a majority of occasions, to the point where their own chief whip acknowledged that this was an area in which they'd failed miserably. Now, I am not naive. The whip is always going to be there in a system, because unlike Ambassador O'Malley's constitutional arrangements, an Irish government that ceases to retain the majority, support of a majority in the Dáil must resign. That's written into our constitution. And therefore, on important matters, there has to be cohesion and discipline, certainly in relation to budgetary matters, the way our system is built. We don't have the luxury, if it is a luxury indeed, of having a complete standoff between the executive and the Parliament. We have a different system in which the executive must, in fact, retain and have essentially the support of a majority of parliamentarians. But that does not mean that the government must win every vote on every issue. And it doesn't mean that the defeat of government on any issue in Dáil Éireann is a matter of grave import, a front-page newspaper story, something which suggests that the government is crumbling or whatever, We see right beside us a well-established democracy in which governments survive being rapped on the knuckles by their backbench members of parliament. It doesn't mean that the country becomes ungovernable. Nor does it mean that TDs should be expelled for each and every vote that they take against their party's position. And I believe that maybe the whip system in Ireland has reached its extreme form, that for the slightest vote against the party, you get thrown out of the party, because of our historical legacy going back to the Civil War, where governments were on a knife edge and where survival was all, and where a kind of tribalistic approach was to be found in the formation of government and in their sustenance in office. But we certainly, I think, could have a much healthier, more relaxed and less whipped regime where the government itself would be more relaxed about losing the odd argument or the odd vote and in bowing to cross-party consensus on occasion. Now, it would be odd if I didn't on this occasion mention my old friend Shannon Éireann in this context. I want to thank the MacGill Summer School for being an important, indeed a vital forum in the campaign which I was privileged to take part, and I see Noel Whelan at the end of the hall and others here, to save and above all to reform the Seanad so as to improve the quality of our Parliament and to reform how that Parliament works in future. Not only did that campaign save our Constitution from the wrecking ball, the present government has finally accepted the principle of a Seanad to be elected as to its majority by the people. And although the cynic might say that that acceptance is very belated and won't take place so as to affect the next election, but the one after, I suppose better late than never does apply. But and I think even if the next Seanad is composed on the same legal basis as this one, it will, I hope, be the last to be elected on such a narrow basis. But looking to the Seanad, and you recall the arguments that were made by those people who were giving out about the Seanad and giving out about the possibility that it might be independent of government. We have now arrived at a situation where the government has lost its majority in the Seanad due to one thing and another. And the sky has not fallen in. The country has not become ungovernable. They have to behave with a little bit of politeness and a little bit of persuasive power to get the Seanad to come along with them. And that's exactly what was always envisaged for Shannon Éireann, that it would be a body which was not under the thumb of the executive. And I think that what I suggest in relation to the election of the Ceann Comhairle and the Dáil committees should, of course, also apply to the next Seanad. There's no reason why it shouldn't have a chair which is cross-party. There's no reason why the Cathaoirleach of the Seanad should be a grace and favour appointment of the government. And there's no reason why Seanad committees and joint committees between the Seanad and the Dáil should not be presided over by chairman and vice chairman who are elected on a non-partisan basis by cross-party nomination and secret ballot in the same way as the Ceann Comhairle's position, if my suggestion was accepted. Now, I take this opportunity to make an appeal not only to you as a distinguished audience, but through you and through the media, to all those who now hold elective office, most of whom aspire to do so again in the near future. And my appeal is to them as Democrats and Republicans to avail of a fast-closing window of opportunity to take these practical steps towards a transformation of our political culture and of the way in which our democratic institutions function. There's nothing naive, nothing impractical, nothing in which in any way has not been done elsewhere in similar parliaments in what I'm proposing. And there's, I'd suggest, no reason why it shouldn't be attempted here, given especially that nobody has had the courage to say that they think the present system is the right system and that the present atmosphere and dominance of Dáil Éireann is the right way to do business. I think that if they are implemented, these proposals, which are relatively obvious and relatively uncontroversial, will constitute steps to bring us from a dysfunctional Parliament to a functional Parliament. And if implemented, they will also bring a wind of change, but it will be change for the better. And it seems to me too that these proposals are much what what people actually want to have, because we've been told about new politics, we were promised new politics, it's largely undelivered, and these seem to me to be the very, very minimum building blocks to create a new and different approach to the relationship between our executive and our parliament. And to use John Hume's phrase, these are modest proposals which, as he said, always threaten nobody. Who do these proposals threaten? They only threaten those who haven't the courage or the foresight to see that there are better ways to do our business. Now, when I was listening to Ambassador O'Malley, and he's talking about risk, this is not a big risk. There's no risk in this. We know precisely how it would work. Somebody who wasn't the government's choice would end up Ceann Comhairle. Somebody who wasn't the government's choice would say, hold it, Taoiseach, I'm not happy that this bill should be put through in 2 hours. I think it needs more time. And unless you invoke some emergency provision, I'm going to give more time. It wouldn't be the end of the world if there were more people in the chamber, because that's the way to get called. It wouldn't be the end of the world if the people who are called to speak weren't on a list devised by the party whips. It wouldn't be the end of the world if we left a parliament where people stood up with pre-prepared scripts by backroom boys and girls and who just delivered them to occupy 20 minutes or 30 minutes of their allocated time. None of these things would be some terrible risk of the kind that Ambassador O'Malley says the Irish are cautious about risk. None of these things constitute a risk. All of them are entirely foreseeable, entirely practicable. But the one certainty is that if the standing orders of Dáil Éireann are not changed now, before the election is called, they will be the basis on which the next Ceann Comhairle is selected. And they will be the basis on which the incoming government will hand out all the jobs. And they will be the basis on which the committees will be proposed. And they will be the basis on which the failed mechanisms for accountability will be repeated yet again for another 5 years. You know, when it came to the circumstances in which a Garda commissioner resigned, confidential recipient of Garda complaints was sacked by Minister Shatter, and in which quite controversial things took place. Instead of answering questions straight up in the Dáil and explaining to the TDs what was afoot, we had the Fennelly Commission established. And when I have the height of regard and affection for Niall Fennelly, it is no substitute, and his view is no substitute for immediate accountability to Dáil Éireann for such matters. No other parliament would abase itself in that way and allow the executive to say, we won't answer your questions now, we'll get somebody else to look at them and to report to you, and you'll find out in the fullness of time. So, can I finish by posing a number of questions to you? If these proposals of mine are not the correct steps, what are the correct steps? If not now, when is the appropriate time to do something about it? After the next election, it's too late. And if nobody's opposed, why not do it now, when it could make a very substantial difference? And when those people who go before us in the late autumn or the early winter or the early spring of next year for election would face into an entirely different institution with a different ambience, a different way of doing business, a different spirit, and a prospect for real accountability. Sinna méid atá le rágam a nocht, gur míle magat as éisisteach.